Okay, hi guys. So I'm just back from 3 hours of cricket, and yeah, so please watch until the end. If you can't, then please pause the video and watch later because I really need this thing to work out right now. So at least watch until I start the video because there are other few things which I need to tell. So once done, the main thing is that yeah, I just started with my Township series. I found one of my favorite games on Microsoft Store, which is Township, and I decided to play it. So I'll leave a link to that first video in the description. Please watch it. And the second thing is that related to the last video, so I wasn't able to upload anything yesterday. I was pretty much out for the entire day. I was not at home. So yeah. So we're going to be doing the American Civil War Part 2 now. And we left off around 1862. So I think that was it.
Video was made possible by
Can you increase the volume? Sorry about that.
Honey. Stick around to learn how you can save money when you shop online.
Okay.
As the Union struggle to take control in the East continued, elsewhere, the war raged on. The Confederates attempted an invasion of Kentucky, hoping the state as a whole would join them, but they were pushed back. The Indian Territory saw Native American...
Yeah, the Indian Territory, well, what we know today is Oklahoma, which is this like a neutral zone, I think, but allied with the Union or something, I don't know. But the Oklahoma was known as the Indian Territory, where more American Indians were there than white settlers. They purposely made this for that since so that they could relocate people there and they could use the other land. Because Oklahoma is mostly arid and very high above sea level, so yeah. So they allied themselves with different, and most of them joined the Confederates actually. Cherokee, I feel, were the only ones who joined the Union. I'm not sure.
Tribes ally with one side or the other in the hopes of securing rights after the war. Along the Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant remained one of the few Union generals scoring.
He was one of the few Union generals scoring victories, as he just said. But he wasn't just scoring minor victories where, like McClellan, he had like 80,000 men, he was facing 20,000. He actually scored victories when he was far outnumbered. Like when he had 50,000 and the enemy had 60,000. He was still scoring victories like that.
Major victories with his best pal, General Sherman.
And Sherman. So one thing about General Sherman you should know is that both of them were from Ohio. Sherman was an orphan, and yeah, his adopted father was a man named Ewing. I forgot his first name, but his last name was Ewing. The Ewing family was like family which dealt in a lot of politics, so he was also involved. And Sherman answered this. Grant stood next to me and Sherman had many mental health issues at the start of the war. I'll explain what he said later, so I can just explain this. He had many mental health issues at the start of the war. He was actually thinking of committing suicide when the war began. So then later at the end of it, Sherman said, Grant stood by me when I was crazy, and we already covered Grant's alcohol problems in the last video. So Sherman said, Grant stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. And now we stand together always.
Sherman by his side, Grant led his armies down the Mississippi to the Confederate stronghold of...
Sherman went on the west side and Grant went on the east side, I believe. So yeah.
Vicksburg. Both sides knew that if Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be split in two, and the Confederates prepared for an intense defense of the city.
Yeah, but you might be like, wait, it's most of the Confederacy east of that? Like, the only states that are mostly west of that is Louisiana, only having a bit of territory east of that. Then Arkansas, then Oklahoma wasn't a state and didn't join them, and Texas. So only Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas are mostly west of it. But because we talk about New Orleans, the food would get there, and then Mississippi River would take it. And then when it was somewhere around the central area near Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas border, they just take it to the other parts of the Confederacy.
But back in the East, Lincoln still wanted somebody to march south and take Richmond. Having given General McClellan the boot, he needed a new man in charge. All right, Mr. President. Option 1 is General Hooker. Bit of a nutcase, but a good general.
Yeah.
Option 2, his qualifications are his name is Burnside, and he is freaking...
Yeah, and Burnside did not want to command the Army of the Potomac. when he said he was going to be given command of it, people report that he wept like a child. He was a good division commander and a corps commander, but not an army commander. Same with Hooker.
Dope-ass sideburns. Say no more. So General Burnside was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac and sent south. Lincoln hoped he finally had a general who could succeed. Burnside met General Lee at the city of Fredericksburg, where he intended to rapidly cross the river.
That was the largest battle on the amount of men that were there. If you count it as casualties, that wasn't the largest.
River and take the city.
Yeah.
But the Union War Department was
and when the order was given to send the bridges by one of the head of staff of the Union thing, already after Burnside had wanted the pontoon bridges there. So that's how long it took.
Also in delivering the pontoon bridges, and the two sides were forced to camp across from each other, close enough to speak.
Yeah.
Hey, Yankee, ready to get your butt kicked?
Eddie.
Yeah, right, Rebel. God is on our side. No way, God's on our side. Oh, you think so?
Nah,
well, why don't we ask him?
side?
Hey, God, whose side are you on?
Very much.
Dude, uncool. With over 100,000 men,
Yeah.
the Union Army finally launched
He had
their
like 120,000. Lee had like 80,000. So there were like 200,000 people there. I should say men because only men were allowed to enlist in the army at the time.
massive attack on the 11th
Sorry about that.
of December, but by now, the Confederates had amassed their forces. During the battle, wave after wave of brave Union men marched headlong into a brutal Confederate onslaught.
Yeah.
Even the Confederates couldn't believe what they were seeing, and in one moment of camaraderie, a Confederate sergeant, unable to take it, reportedly came out into the field to tend to...
He was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga. The Angel of Murray's Heights. I forgot his name, but I think his name is the Angel of Murray's Heights. Well, that was a nickname given after war, but during I forgot his actual name.
The Union wounded. Seeing this, the Union troops held their fire. Still, Burnside and his forces were soundly defeated at Fredericksburg and forced to retreat. Lincoln's popularity and Northern morale continued to plummet, especially as the winter heading into 1863 was bad. The winter camps were rife with disease. The food was less than appealing. On both sides, men began to leave. Hey, where do you think you're going? I'm deserting. What? Don't you love your country? Yes, I do. And I'm trying to get back to it as quick as I can.
Many people think that there were mass executions for deserters, but actually there weren't. Lincoln was kind and he pardoned most of their death sentences. They might have been branded and might have had to serve for a longer time, but that's about the worst you could get. Because branded basically means they put D on your cheek or something like that.
Lincoln, ever the kind and caring man he was, spent much of his time pardoning deserters' death sentences. Oh my. Here's a 17-year-old boy sentenced to be hanged. Well, I'd better suspend his sentence. Or he'll be suspended tomorrow.
Yeah, I literally need to think about this joke so long. Now I finally have understood it. Because like I was watching like a meme review and then they showed this one, like suspend this thing. So yeah, so I finally understood it. It's a joke. So when people are hanged, like I'm not going to go too in depth, but when people are hanged, they're actually suspended off the ground. That's what he means. He'll be suspended off the ground when he's hanged. So that's why he says he's going to suspend his sentence, or he'll be suspended tomorrow.
What? To try to keep the numbers up, both sides had
They were originally about to write constipation, but then they wrote conscription.
Introduced conscription. There was controversy in the North, however, since rich men could simply pay to have someone else
It's like a $400 bounty, I think, which was
fight on their behalf. Riots broke out in New York City, with enraged mobs furious at the idea of going to fight for slaves, an idea that many of them simply did not support. However, after so much pressure, the Union had finally begun allowing black men to enlist, and these men, knowing what they were fighting for, signed up. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 troops, 10% of the Union...
Yeah, and 10% of the Union Army was black, but they weren't mixed in with white men, I mean, because they had white commanders, but they weren't mixed in with white men, enlisted men.
Army would be black, the valor and bravery they showed throughout, silencing critics. Okay, well that last guy was useless. Let's try this Hooker fellow. General Joseph Hooker was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and once again, Lincoln ordered him to move south and take Richmond.
Why south? Why don't you go from West Virginia and move southwest, move south from West Virginia, then move east, and while you're doing that, send also a part of the army in the north. So Lee will have to keep bouncing around, which would be hard if both armies are really close to Richmond.
Hooker met Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Hooker had over twice the men Lee did.
Yeah, and Chancellorsville was where Stonewall Jackson was killed.
Lee was forced to defy all military convention.
Oh, and also there were some men still stationed at Fredericksburg. So yeah.
And split his smaller force into two. Lee had absolutely no chance of winning, and
He
Lee won.
Yep.
It was his masterpiece. Lee did suffer one significant loss during the battle, though. As his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was riding back to the Confederate lines at night, the nervous Confederate troops, unable to recognize him, opened fire. You boys done goofed up. Jackson died
He died 8 days later, but he didn't die of the wound itself. He died of pneumonia because he always put rags, like cold rags, on his face and chest before sleeping. And then one of his not slaves, but one of his people who try taking care of him, doctors basically, who knew him well, just one of the people who made one of them. They saw him doing that, and then they put it there, and then that infected the wound with pneumonia and all that. So yeah.
days later. As for Lincoln, he couldn't believe it.
Yep.
It was yet another loss, and Northern support continued to waver. While the Union kept on struggling, out west, unconditional surrender Grant was making moves as always, in an attempt to take Vicksburg.
Anything better than Lee? Anything. Most people give Lee was a better tactician, but Grant was a better strategist.
On the Mississippi, he made a series of risky and bold movements. He sent a cavalry raid and feigned Sherman north to confuse the enemy. Then, aided by a fleet of ironclads on the river, he raced his army south to cross the Mississippi. Aware that the terrain to the north was restrictive, instead, he strategically moved northeast, hitting Vicksburg's supply line and defending his rear from Confederate armies in Jackson.
Yeah, and him doing that also, since Vicksburg had two connections, and one of them was already blocked off by the Union. They only need to get this connection now, and once they got that, it was pretty much up for Vicksburg. I mean, Jackson's one of the largest cities in Mississippi, currently the capital of Mississippi. So yeah, that pretty much lost them the chance of holding Vicksburg.
Once he reached Vicksburg, the Confederate defense became hardened, and Grant was forced to settle in for a month-long siege, during which time he got rather bored.
That's why he was having
Despite not taking the city, Lincoln loved it and encouraged Grant to hold firm. It would only be a matter of time before the Mississippi was in Union.
And then they could send supplies through the Mississippi, and the Mississippi can go as far north as Montana, which is one of the largest states in the U.S., one of the least populated states in the U.S. though, but also pretty far north. I mean, if we're talking north, that's on the border with Canada. So yeah, that's how far it goes. And it also goes as far east as about central Pennsylvania, I think. So yeah.
Hands. Around this time, the people in the west of Virginia, who had remained loyal to the Union throughout, finally broke away to form their own
West
state.
Virginia.
They could have named it anything.
Okay. Alternative names: Kanawha, Vandalia, Big Mountain Mama State, Florida, Canada, the second, Mississippi. Okay. High School Musical, the musical series, the state, and left Virginia. But they chose West Virginia.
In the world, but the creative minds at the time came up with the ingenious West Virginia.
Yep.
Back in Washington, Lincoln once again wanted a new general to take command. Oh my goodness, why do all these 19th century generals look so bust?
Then he puts George Meade in command.
Look, we got Sleepy Eyes Joe here. That's Princess Leia
Abner Doubleday, who did not invent baseball.
with a mustache. E.T. phoned the doctor. Fine, why don't we give Snapping Turtle McGee here a shot?
His name's not Snapping Turtle McGee. That was his nickname given to him by the soldiers because he looked like Snapping Turtle and he had a fiery temper. His name was actually General George Meade.
So General Snapping Turtle McGee was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and it was a crucial time for the Union because once again, the Confederates decided to go on the attack. So far, they had done exceedingly well militarily.
Okay, let's read this. We have some military progress, a lot of military progress. pretty darn good military progress.
Terribly, but as the war kept going,
Yeah,
the
the
Confederate
economy is terrible. No economic downturn, lots of economic downturn. Mucho grande economic downturn.
economy was crumbling.
Yep.
Riots broke out in the streets of Richmond as the price of bread skyrocketed. Supplies were dwindling.
Bad.
Jefferson Davis wanted to send men west to rescue Vicksburg, but General Lee knew the longer the war lasted, the worse their chances got.
And if they could go there and capture the president, vice president, at the time, it was unstable. If they had done that, they might have actually won. So that would have been helpful to them. If they had gone just north into West Virginia, then cross over not into Pennsylvania, well, maybe go in a bit, and then immediately go here, cutting off Washington, D.C. That's all you do.
And he still hoped if he could just threaten D.C., the already demoralized North would surrender. So in June 1863, with the momentum behind him, General Lee once again entered the North, fighting his way through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. General Meade set out to meet him for what would be the most significant battle of the entire
Gettysburg always overshadowed Vicksburg. I would consider Vicksburg to be a lot more significant than Gettysburg.
war.
Oh, and the Confederates changed their flag many times, so yeah.
Confederates won, D.C. could fall. If the Union won, it would be a turning point, as the Confederates would run out of steam, and the small town that was to get caught up in the crossfire of the largest battle in American history was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On June 1st, units from each army encountered one another and skirmished through the town itself. The townspeople were forced to take refuge, except for one man who reported
that guy who took the beans. I mean, he was just like, he just rescued his beans. That's it. He didn't care about himself. Okay, so here it is. So John Lawrence Burns, I believe his name was. He died in 1872. Veteran of War of 1812, became 69 civilian about the Gettysburg during the American Civil War. He was wounded but survived to become a national celebrity. If you want to read more, I'll leave the link to this page, which I got. Then you can just keep scrolling down trying to find some stuff. So yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
reportedly ran outside for a strange reason. Joseph, what are you doing? I'm not gonna let them take my beans. How many times do I have to tell you they're not here for your beans? By the second day, over 100,000 men stretched for miles across the battlefield. Lee took the initiative, deciding to hit the enemy's flanks, and he came very close to breaking through the Union's disorganized left.
I mean, if that happens, if this thing's exactly how it depicts, you can move this unit back and plug up the gap and immediately pull flanking maneuver.
But Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet.
I was confused between Joshua Chamberlain, the Union Colonel, and Neville Chamberlain, who was the president of the UK when World War I started. So yeah.
Charge, smashing into the Confederates and forcing them back. The Union forces held across the line. On the final day, Lee believed the Union Army had fortified its flanks, so he decided to finish them off with one massive central assault. The Confederates rushed at the Union lines during General Pickett's charge, and this time, it was the Union's turn to unleash hell. Meade had correctly guessed Lee's strategy, and the Confederates were decimated, forced to turn and flee. A devastated General Lee called out to his fleeing and wounded men, telling them it was his fault. And after holding for a counterattack that never came, he ordered a retreat back into Virginia.
Hey, when you saw the army, why didn't you just disengage, move north, and just move there and make them think that? But as soon as you get out their side, just move straight south of Washington. I mean, wouldn't that have worked as good? Just disengage, simple.
Virginia. The North had just managed to score a massive victory.
I'm looking at this 100 and I'm looking at this like 100 and for 160 years later, so yeah.
And one they desperately needed. And if that wasn't enough, in the West, after a month-long siege, Vicksburg finally fell. The North now held the Mississippi. And better yet, it was the 4th of July. With control of the Mississippi, Union forces moved into Arkansas and Tennessee. Tennessee in particular saw heavy fighting, with Union General Rosecrans...
Rosecrans was incompetent. His generals were very competent. That's how he won a few battles. But Bragg was very competent, but his generals underneath him, like his colonels and corps commanders, were very, very incompetent. I mean, they barely did well.
Masterfully pushing Braxton Bragg's Army of the Tennessee out of Tennessee.
Did all
He
of
suffered a
this
major
also.
setback, however, at the bloody Battle of Chickamauga and ended up under a Confederate siege at
Damn.
Chattanooga. At one point during the siege, a temporary truce was declared so that wounded men could
But I mean, if it says temporary truce, why don't you sneak a few men out at night to go and get a relief force? I mean, wouldn't that work?
be recovered. And often in the Civil War, during these small truces, men from both sides would meet in the middle to trade things like tobacco, coffee, and maybe even honey.
Okay, yep, this is his promotion. So yeah.
Vicksburg, 4th of July, and the Siege of Chattanooga. Thankfully, General Grant, now in charge of
Yeah.
all Western Union
He sent a
armies,
relief
showed up and karate kicked Bragg right back into Georgia. Like this.
Sherman Rosecrans or Sherman, that looks, I think that's Rosecrans, Braggs, and then Grant.
With Sherman and Hooker, Grant took on Confederate positions in the mountains around the city, including the famous battle
Yeah.
above the clouds and
Missionary.
Mission Ridge. Grant continued to be Lincoln's #1 guy. With these victories, Lincoln hoped the war was finally
It
turning.
was.
Back in Gettysburg, the entire town had been turned into a hospital to care for the scores of wounded men. Throughout the war, on both sides, women such as Clara Barton rose to the occasion, doing crucial work on the home front and volunteering as nurses for those who had given their lives. A new national cemetery was to be established at Gettysburg, and Abraham Lincoln traveled out to attend the opening ceremony. At the event, the main speaker spoke for 2 hours. Then, Abraham Lincoln was called forward to give some brief, appropriate remarks.
Okay, so we know this is Gettysburg Address, which is one of the best speeches in American history, but at the time it was considered to be one of the worst because many people didn't like it. And but then the person who told the speech, of course, name, the person who told the initial 2 hour speech, said it took me 2 hours to get to the point, but it only took you, I think it was like 2 or 3 minutes, which he spoke. So yeah.
In just 2 minutes,
Yeah.
he masterfully and
Nice.
poignantly iterated America's
4 years ago basically means 87 years ago because 1 score equals 20 years. So yeah.
national purpose and the need to continue the fight. The Gettysburg Address would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. While they were now making progress, the North still couldn't find a decisive victory in the East, and that was
If they could get that connection between the two main areas, then they could attack from also the south, which would also be very helpful.
bad news for Lincoln because his presidency was now in its 4th
Oh,
year.
yeah.
In 1864,
Yeah.
there was an election coming. The Confederates knew this too, and with little hope left of being able to threaten the North militarily, they believed their last shot at
Yoga, coffee with Robert E. Lee, I'd say Jefferson Davis said that, and election.
victory may be in the election, since Lincoln, emancipation, and the war itself weren't exactly popular. People in the North were sick of war and wanted to put it behind them. Robert E. Lee hoped that if he could just
That's how the people of Britain felt.
hold out
Yeah,
and
Lord.
continue to inflict more defeats, the people of the North would vote Lincoln out and replace him with a Southern sympathizer who may be willing to negotiate.
President.
Lincoln knew now he desperately needed a victory. Now, I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified. If Lincoln loves General Grant so
Government charged the armies in the east.
much, then why doesn't he put him in charge of the campaign in the East? Well, guess what, loyal subscriber? You've hit the nail
On the
on the
head.
head. You're bold, Grant. I'll grant you
Grant?
that. I'm
What?
promoting you to General-in-Chief, and I ain't taking you for granted.
Twice?
Now I want you to go defeat Lee. Grant me my wish.
Yes.
Please stop. So Grant was put in charge, and he came up with a new plan. He wanted to press the Confederates on all
Yeah,
fronts,
that's
with
what-
General Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama, General Sherman moving south to Atlanta, and Grant joining the Army of the Potomac as they advanced through Virginia. In May 1860,
Yeah, Butler came from here when the Union conquered North Carolina and Virginia was moving in. While Sigel and Meade were also under his command.
that plan went into action. Sherman steadily advanced on Atlanta, facing off against the smaller Confederate army under General Joseph E. Johnston. In addition, a cruel yet
Nathaniel
highly skilled
Bedford
cavalry
Forrest.
general and winner of the funniest Confederate statue award, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was also nearby, doing his best to threaten Sherman's advance. But in a series of battles, Sherman dominated and pushed Johnson back to the city. But he was held just outside of Atlanta itself and was forced to lay siege. Meanwhile,
Yep.
the main show was happening to the east in Virginia. The Union's top general was finally about to face off against the Confederacy's. Lincoln hoped Grant would bring something new to the Eastern Theater, and bring something new. He did. As Grant began moving south, Lee still regularly outmaneuvered him and inflicted.
Yeah, and what some people, Grant, even though taking heavy casualties, he just kept moving to Richmond. While other generals, after taking maybe 1-2 battles, sort of decided, okay, it's up, we're going to retreat back to Washington.
Heavy casualties, hoping to demoralize the North as much as he could. But here's what set Grant apart from others. He knew Lee was running out of men, and that the North by comparison had plenty. Grant would throw his forces at Lee, and even when Lee repelled them, Grant, rather than pulling back, would give the order to keep moving forward and flank Lee, again and again. In under 6 weeks, 80,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing. In D.C., Grant was criticized for being a butcher. At the Battle of the Wilderness, the Union casualties were so heavy that Grant reportedly began to weep. But still, Grant could replace his losses. Lee couldn't, and he was being pushed all the way back to Richmond.
Sorry about that. The only reason if you could see it kind of odd was because I had the nightlight mode on, so yeah.
Lee knew once he got there, he'd be under siege. Then it would only be a matter of time.
He actually said that.
Close to Richmond, Grant again suffered horrific casualties in a miscalculated assault at Cold Harbor. Then, trying to be a trickster, instead of moving on Richmond directly, Grant moved towards Petersburg to flank the Confederate capital and cut.
And the only reason it did not fall is because of a Confederate army, because since they didn't get the orders, they were disobeying it, or they just didn't get the orders to move to Richmond in time. They stayed in Petersburg, and that's what saved the city and let the Confederates last a little bit longer.
Its supply line. But just like Sherman, Grant was halted outside of the city, and he too was forced to settle in for a siege. 2 identical sieges would not be good enough for Lincoln's re-election. The people of the North saw the casualties Grant had been taking, and they weren't happy. To make matters worse, Lee had sent Jubal Early north to threaten D.C. with the hope of forcing Grant to withdraw troops from Richmond. Early was repelled on the outskirts of the city, with President Lincoln even attending as an observer, but the North had been given a fright. So with the war currently in a stalemate, who was to be Lincoln's opponent in the critical 1864 election? Who would the Democrats choose? Guess what, baby? I'm back. That's right. General George B. McClellan would run for president against Abraham Lincoln. My fellow countrymen, if you elect me, I, the great General George McClellan, will fearlessly and valiantly win the war.
Yeah, he personally wanted to win the war, but he ended up making peace with Confederates because most of the people did not want to win the war. They just wanted to get over with it.
Unlike this douchebag, many Democrats, however, including McClellan's running mate, wanted to end the war. So it's possible McClellan may have ended up fearlessly and valiantly making peace with the Confederates, which is exactly what they were hoping for. With the war in a stalemate and Lincoln still not popular, it looked like McClellan would win, and the Confederacy may have a chance at surviving after all. Lincoln himself said that without some kind of major victory, it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Well, fret not, Abe, because if it's a major victory you want, it's a major victory you'll get. Atlanta had been under siege by General Sherman for just over a month. After a number of battles around the city, Sherman sent a force south to sever the city's supply line, and Confederate General Hood was forced to abandon it. Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's most
and then he didn't just stay there and keep the supply line coming. He just was like Napoleon and went through the land. I mean, he just survived off it.
Important cities had fallen into Union hands.
And Atlanta wasn't this big hub as we know today. It was like the 4th largest city in Georgia at the time, though it's the capital.
For many, it was clear that the Confederacy's defeat was now inevitable, and the war would soon be over. When the final results came in, Lincoln had won with an electoral college landslide, with the troops in particular voting overwhelmingly for Lincoln, which must have been touching for their commander-in-chief. Hey man, looks like you lost. No hard feelings? I didn't lose.
I merely
failed to win.
Yeah.
In January, Lincoln involved himself heavily in ensuring the 13th Amendment made it through Congress.
Yeah, he would die a few months later, which is sad.
In a narrow and historic vote, the amendment passed. Slavery would now be constitutionally banished throughout the nation. Black men and women, watching the vote from the galleries, knew the work had only just begun. A couple months later, at his second inauguration,
there's John Wilkes Booth right there. I'll show you again.
Knew the work had only just begun. A couple months later.
Yeah, there's John Wilkes Booth. You can actually see him in the picture at Lincoln's second inaugural. He's right there. The guy with the mustache. He's the only person detailed because they just want you to remember that that's him.
At his second inauguration, with victory right around the corner, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. Instead, he emphasized the need for reunification and binding up wounds. To him, Americans, North or South, were to again be compatriots. However, listening to Lincoln speak that day was a man who had no interest in reunification, John Wilkes Booth. An actor living in D.C. was also a deep Southern sympathizer, and as the war turned against the Confederacy, depressed and full of hate, he was already plotting his revenge on the man he held responsible. With further Confederate losses, it was pretty clear at this point.
Most of Tennessee was gone, most of Virginia was gone, parts of Georgia was gone, most of Arkansas.
But still, Jefferson Davis showed no sign of giving in. The North were frustrated.
It was kind of like Hitler in World War II. He showed no sign of giving in.
To see the conflict being dragged out, why waste more lives? In Atlanta, General Sherman believed he had the key to forcing the Confederacy's hand. He had an unusually modern concept that an army...
a total war. That's called today. Not the game. I'm talking about how it's played. I mean, not the game. I'm talking about how it's done. Total war. An army can only survive if the people strike the people. The army falls.
Could only survive with the support of the people. Strike at the people, and the army collapses. Sherman decided to do something unprecedented. He would remove his 62,000 men from their supply line and march through the heartland of the Confederacy, where they would live off the land. There, they would wreak havoc. As they marched, they tore up railroads, burned farms, and destroyed communication lines. They also liberated thousands of slaves. The damage done was estimated at $1.4 billion. The tactics were cruel, but to Sherman, it was better than losing yet more men in battle. In December, he reached Savannah, Georgia, but he wasn't done yet. Next, he turned north to...
And they didn't know he was doing this. They thought he was still in Atlanta. They didn't know that he had marched all the way down to Savannah because he wasn't in contact with any Union thing to tell. Because then when he reached Savannah, he got in touch with the Navy. That's how the Union knew that he had marched down there.
To inflict his...
Which split the Confederacy into 3 parts now.
Punishment on the first state to secede, South Carolina. As he moved, he came ever closer to General Lee's army, still holding out at Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg had lasted for 292 days. 60,000 of Lee's men had deserted. Numerous Union attempts to break through had failed, but when the breakthrough finally came, it came quick. On April 2nd, a Union assault finally pushed the Confederates from their defenses. Hey man, there's no need to evacuate, right? You'll rescue us like last...
And Jefferson Davis was actually in church when the order was given to evacuate.
Time, right? Sorry, can't hear you. Lee narrowly escaped the city, hoping he'd be able to meet up with General Johnson and continue the fight. Grant chased him down. Richmond...
Just move south. No need to move all the way west. Just move south.
...was evacuated, and Jefferson Davis went on the run. As they left, the Confederates set fire to military buildings, but the flames burnt out of control, and as the Union troops arrived, they became firefighters. A couple of days later, Abraham Lincoln visited the war-torn city. Grant caught up to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse.
Appomattox Courthouse, where Wilmer McLean lives. I told in the first episode that he told that the war started in my backyard and ended in my house. So Lee's surrender happened at Appomattox when Virginia surrendered.
Where he trapped his forces. It was here, on April 9th, 1865, that Lee saw no point in continuing. Sir? Listen, bub, I drank a bit too much last night.
Yeah, he didn't drink to have a migraine. He was just having a migraine. So no.
And now I'm hanging like a fruit bat on a hot day. So whatever you have to say, I don't want to hear it. General Lee says he wants to surrender. Hot diggity dog!
And as soon as he heard that, his hair was gone.
Grant and Lee met in the home of a nearby farm family, owned by a man who had tried his best to escape the Civil War years earlier, Wilmer McLean. All right, can we all just hurry up and get this over with? Martha, not now! I'm cleaning. Do you want us to get...
Can't you just wait for like, I don't know, 2 hours maybe?
Rats! Grant and Lee, after years of war, now spoke respectfully to one another. When Lee left, his face filled with emotion, Grant's men began to cheer, but Grant ordered them to stop. He knew that now was the time for reconciliation. Just over 2 weeks later, General Johnson would surrender to Sherman, ending the war for 89,000 Confederate soldiers in the largest surrender of the war. Not every Confederate state...
That Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas was still there and parts of the Indian Territory.
Had surrendered, but the war was as good as over. Across the North, church bells rang out and celebrations erupted. In Washington, Lincoln gave a speech from the White House to a jubilant crowd, in which, among various things, he expressed his support for black voting rights. Lincoln had seen the nation through its deepest crisis. The presidency had visibly aged him.
This was like a week or two before he died. This picture was taken.
He had lost over 20 pounds. He said sometimes, "I think I am the tiredest man on earth." I'm not sure tiredest is a word, but geez, the man's exhausted. Cut him some slack. On a carriage ride with Mary, Lincoln clearly was looking forward to being a president in a time of peace. He was apparently very cheerful, surprising his wife, and he told her that between the war and the loss of their son, they'd both been very miserable. Now, it was time to be happy. On the evening of April 14th, Lincoln attended a play
and Ambrose Burnside was actually there. And people claim that Lincoln was shot when he was looking at Burnside. See, Burnside right there.
His wife and some friends at Ford's Theater. It was a comedy, and the president appeared to be enjoying it very much. In a nearby bar, John Wilkes Booth swallowed 2 glasses.
Yeah, they assassinated Lincoln, but they were also supposed to assassinate William Seward, Secretary of the Treasury, and Andrew Johnson, Vice President. If they assassinated Johnson and not Lincoln, America would have been different. America would have been a much better place if they had assassinated Johnson and not Lincoln.
Of brandy.
Yep.
He slipped quietly into the president's booth and awaited for the audience's laughter to rise.
It's not about Seward. Seward got America, Alaska, so yeah. Sorry about that. You're shocked.
The president was shot in the back of the head. Booth fled the city. Soldiers carried Lincoln to a boarding house across the street. There, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. Surrounded by his heartbroken wife, son, and members of cabinet, at 7:22 the next morning,
he died.
President Lincoln passed away. Never before had a president been murdered. A shock.
Presidents had died in office, but they were never murdered. Like William, sorry, that's my dog. I forgot the name of that guy. Wait, let me just. 9th US president. I need to think about that. Yeah, okay, I was right. It was a William. It was William Henry Harrison. He had died in office due to pneumonia. Okay, so this picture. This is Lincoln's funeral in New York City. Those 2 boys right there. One guy there, one guy there. There's future President Theodore Roosevelt and his brother Elliot, I think.
Nation mourned as a 12-day funeral procession carried Lincoln back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. On April 26th, Union cavalry found John Wilkes Booth in a barn in Virginia, where he was shot. Not long after, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was also tracked down and arrested. Imprisoned for 2 years, he was eventually released. The North didn't want to put him on trial for fear the jury may rule that Southern secession had in fact been legal. To ensure reconciliation, other Confederate generals and politicians were allowed to re-enter life in the now restored Union. Scattered fighting continued into May.
Yeah, and actually the Confederates won the last battle of the war, which was near El Paso, I think. It was somewhere here.
When the last Confederate forces in Texas disintegrated, the southern states came under Northern military occupation to prevent any further rebellion, and a very difficult era of Reconstruction began. Over 3 million Americans had fought.
The only reason I think it was 3 million, and I know the exact numbers. Confederates fought 1 million and Union 2 million, because it said black soldiers made up about 1/10 of the army. So yeah, so I just multiplied that by 10, made 2 million, and then I realized that was 1 million for the Confederacy.
Brother against brother.
Yeah.
The Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history.
Yeah, that's true.
But the Union had been preserved. You could say the real winners were those who were to never again be slaves.
Well, in the South, that wasn't true, because they came under attack from the KKK or the Klan. In the North, that was good.
Further amendments passed by Congress gave black individuals the right to citizenship and to vote.
Yeah.
Significant progress had been made.
Well, black individuals could seek citizenship, but only black men could vote. Sorry.
However, Entering into the 20th century,
Here's
it
a
was
part
clear the fight for
150
equality
here.
would continue. In modern America, the man who fought to preserve the nation and never gave up in the darkest of times.
Okay, Lincoln Memorial. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever.
Stands as a symbol of honesty, empathy, humility, perseverance, and courage.
Yeah.
A continuous reminder of what has forged America and what it should ever strive to be.
Okay, guys. So yeah, so that ended, and that's good. So I'm not gonna be doing any more simplified. So next, I'm gonna be doing Kings and Generals Caesar in Gaul, and I absolutely love that series. I really want to. I've seen like the history to it, and Kings and Generals is a really good channel. So I'm gonna be doing that a day after. Not, I'm only gonna upload my township tomorrow. So yeah. So thanks for watching, and yeah. So bye.